Hello, everyone. My name is Thais Italiani, and thank you for taking the time to watch our on-demand webinar, Ukraine War and Commodities, a look back at the agriculture market 1 year later. This webinar is dedicated to analyzing the impact of the war in Ukraine on the agriculture commodity markets. It has been 1 year since the start of the conflict, and we believe it's important to take a closer look at what has changed and what the future may hold. I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Trant, our head of West Agriculture. Welcome, Chris.
Well, hello, Thais, and hello, everyone watching. I appreciate you attending. And without further ado, let's get started. As Thais mentioned, we are at the 1 year mark of one of the most consequential events in my lifetime. Today, we're going to discuss in very, very quick order what the world looked like in agriculture before the invasion. I'm going to try to cover the entire conflict in 5 minutes. Not an easy feat, but at least to cover the broad strokes of what's happened in the last year. I'm going to discuss the initial market reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm going to discuss, as the conflict evolved, what happened with the supply flow, including the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Then I'll wrap up with the current front lines, the current situation, what the export market looks like, and some ideas on what we might expect in the year to come. To get us started, there's some themes that I want to take a step back and kind of address. History is one of those things that you can always claim to have a bias or an insight, but the truth is that no one actually knows what occurred, all the facts, and no one knows what's going to happen down the line. There are two quotes I liked from my high school history teacher. What is past is merely the prologue, and history does not always repeat itself, but it usually does rhyme. Themes in 2022 that I saw outside of the headlines: black swans begot black swans. The initial black swan of the Russian invasion was replaced with a new black swan of a full-scale war continuing. The challenge to feed the world has never been harder. There are supply disruptions in every corner of the world last year, and there's never been more mouths to feed. Geopolitics and domestic politics trump economics. How things should work on a supply and demand table do not always translate into political realities. And the commodity market ecosystem can make changes in supply and demand very, very violent. On the charts on the right there, you'll see the closing price the day before the Russian invasion for nearby wheat, soybeans, corn, and then soybean oil and soybean meal. And then I looked up where the peak was after that, after the invasion. Wheat prices surged 30%, corn and soybean oil up 20%, and it occurred in very short order. So keep that in mind as we discuss what happened, because I think it's the high water mark for the results of the invasion. But these themes, again, will be experienced more so in the year ahead. To get us started from a high level perspective of last year, the war began. Tensions were high for quite some time. The Russian invasion hits. Prices then cooled off. As prices cooled, we saw the Ukraine disruption take place globally. India placed restrictions on wheat. Indonesia placed export restrictions on palm oil. The Black Sea corridor was a deal that was finally reached, allowing supply to flow out of the Black Sea again. But where we are now relative to where we started with the invasion, we are one more major disaster away from another supply shock as seen from number 2. So moving forward, this is something that I wanted to illustrate. This is the minute chart from the day of the invasion. I'm sure many people on this call remember where they were when they got the breaking news. I'm sure they remember their day in the office, the volatility, the risk, the uncertainty. Chart on the left is corn. Chart on the right is wheat. The corn and wheat board took the initial news to the reaction in the Russian invasion by going limit up, and then quickly followed by limit down, and then, of course, surged into the spring. The reason why it went from limit up to limit down, after the initial shock, there were some individuals who believed that this invasion will be a cakewalk. It will be something that's over in a matter of weeks, if not days. And the agricultural supply of Ukraine at that time was already harvested for corn, and the wheat exports were nearly done. So there wasn't any damage done to the agricultural system, at least initially. Before we get into the events of what happened, I want to cover a little bit on what Ukraine is and what it was before the invasion. It was one of the historic breadbaskets of the world. 25% of the world's natural black soil is found in Ukraine. Over half the landmass, you can grow stuff on it. That's an area larger than the country of Italy. It was the fourth largest exporter of corn, the fifth largest exporter of wheat. Most of that was shipped via the Black Sea. Where Ukraine is in the world, it's very, very close to major destinations of commodity demand. So North Africa, the Middle East, these are countries with high populations, not much arable land, and Ukraine has, along with Russia, of course, they're the closest geography of major supply. Before the invasion, Ukraine was coming off a record corn and a record wheat crop. Record corn crop, 42 million metric tons. The area expansion in Ukraine corn was up 25% over the last 5 years. So just massive, improvements from previous years. And then the wheat crop was also a record, 33 million metric tons on a record area. So prior to the invasion, Ukraine was producing more and more, and of course they were exporting more and more. Speaking of exports and speaking of the destinations of the Ukrainian agricultural exports, they're countries that are critical, both near and far. Starting with corn, about 1/5 of China's corn came from Ukraine. Historically, before China was a major buyer of U.S. corn, they almost exclusively purchased Ukrainian corn when they wanted to. Further, closer to Ukraine, countries such as Turkey, the Middle East, export 70% of their corn from Ukraine. And this was a trend that was growing. So as they were growing more and more corn, they were shipping more of it, certainly to China with very large growth, but also to the EU and Turkey as well. Turning to wheat, which is perhaps the crop Ukraine's most famous for, it was responsible for feeding a good chunk of the world's population. Egypt, with over 90 million people, is the #1 importer of wheat in the world. 50% of that food was imported from the Ukraine. A third was imported via Turkey from Ukraine. So these are basically the countries in the world that have high populations that require to be fed. The population cannot get enough nutrients from the agricultural industry at home, so they have to import food to meet up that difference. Turning to the WASD in February 2022. Overall, we were supposed to have a year where ending stocks increased for corn from 292 million up to 302 million. As mentioned before, Ukraine had a record corn production. China was by far its biggest buyer. Ukraine was shipping a record amount of corn, and China was buying everything they could from Ukraine's exports. There were also headlines that tensions were increasing in the Black Sea as Russia put troops on the border of Ukraine and then moved them around. But the WASD headline on February 9th was really centered on South America production and drought expectations in Brazil and Argentina. On the wheat side, they also believe there's going to be a tighter cut relative to corn. Again, Ukraine record crop, 33 million metric tons, expected to have record exports. The chief of the World Food Program on February 18th gave a speech. This is before the invasion. This is before the invasion was even given. And he basically said that the world is very close to having a mass famine type situation. Ending stocks declining year after year. The world is increasing population-wise every day, right? So before this invasion even started, there are alarm bells sounding that there could be a lot of hungry people in the near future if another domino or crop failure were to happen. Before we get into the events of the invasion and its impact on the commodity market, I want to take a step back, do a little history analysis on the events that happened, and what led us here. Start at the beginning. You have to go to the beginning, and you can go back as far as you want. I chose 2013. That's when protests in Kiev occurred after the pro-Russian government of Ukraine backed out of an EU-Ukraine economic treaty. A new Ukrainian government was formed after the former Russian-backed president left the country. Russia responded by seizing the Crimea in almost a bloodless takeover. And then the war in the Donbass, which is the region to the east of Ukraine, heavily populated by Russian-speaking Ukrainians, began to rebel against the new Ukrainian government. You could argue this war didn't necessarily start in 2022. It started in 2014 when Russians backed separatists in this region. Ukraine sent their military in. There were peace protocols, and along the way, NATO's relationship with Ukraine increased. Along in closer to 2000, a series of steps happened that ratcheted up tensions. Russia issued passports to the individuals living in these breakaway regions, and Ukrainians, I guess you could say, warmth towards NATO increased. They declared themselves in 2020 as a NATO partner. NATO weapons, although not to the stage we saw them where they currently are now, flowed into the country, and the Ukrainian military began to train with NATO weapons. So that's where we were before the invasion. On February 24th, 2022, Vladimir Putin gave a speech at 4 a.m. Moscow time announcing a special military operation. Now, before I get into the military aspect, taking a step back to look at the crop calendar for Ukraine, this was actually not a bad time for the crops, all things considered, if it was a quick operation, which the market initially thought after the initial shock. The corn crop was already harvested. There were still plenty of shipments to be had for corn exports, but the crop was out of the ground. Meanwhile, on the wheat side, the crop was planted already, but it was still under the ground and not going to come out until harvest time comes summer. So as far as the immediate damage to the agricultural production in Ukraine, if it was a bloodless invasion, like many in the Kremlin were hoping for, and like Crimea in 2014, the ag markets might not have been too impacted. However, I mentioned earlier my themes that black swans begot black swans. So one of the initial black swans that really happened was with the invasion of the country, and not just in Donbass region, but a full-scale offensive. That was something that caught the market off guard. I think the market expected that there'd be some sort of Russian aggression in the Donbass, but surely we wouldn't see a major war broke out. That's not something that happens anymore. That was a point of view that was very wrong. The initial Russian invasion force, over 100,000, stormed Ukraine from 4 directions: Kiev, Kharkiv, the Donbass region, and the south. Resistance and casualties were higher than expected. As soon as the invasion happened, there were rumors that ceasefires were underway. That caused all sorts of market volatility. A year later, we are still waiting for that ceasefire. Also, an important detail that we have to mention, it was the start of the largest refugee crisis since World War II. 8 million people fled Ukraine, which represented about 1/5 of the entire population. From an agricultural perspective, that is quite a bit of domestic demand that no longer has the need to eat because they're not in the country anymore. So the domestic economy of Ukraine suffered tremendously because of this. And the domestic livestock and agriculture market as well, they lost a very important customer of theirs. So now Ukraine, although they were always very dependent on the export market, for any future Ukrainian agricultural program, it'll be even more dependent on the export markets. Also importantly, the Russian Black Sea Fleet blockaded Ukrainian ports and exports ground to essentially zero. Very, very quickly. Kiev was quickly turned into a fortress city overnight. The Ukrainians fought and fought back hard. I mentioned that the original black swan was the invasion. The next black swan was the Ukrainians began to appear to win, not only to stop the Russians, but also drive them back. The Ukrainians deployed the weapons that they were given by the Western powers to great effect. Zelensky stayed defiant, and Russian losses mounted. Over time, between February and May, the Russians realized they were not going to be able to take over the entire country as their initial goal was. Now, on the export commodity side of things, wheat and corn exports ground to a near halt. For wheat, that wasn't too surprising. Most of the wheat had already shipped, but still, any residual shipments were halted. The bigger deal was corn. University of Illinois professor of agriculture economics, Scott Irwin, called it the largest supply shock in lifetime, 600 million bushels. That represented nearly half of the Ukrainian crop allocated to export. And remember, that was a crop that was a record. So the purchases that China had, the purchases that Turkey, North Africa, all had paid for, ready to go. Those stopped overnight and they were trapped in the country. During the stage 2 of the war, the Battle of the Donbass and then the incoming new supply, the Russians realized that they had to change their goals. Their next goal was to take over just the eastern part of the country called the Donbass. Over the summer, the Russians did actually have a degree of success. They captured 2 cities, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. In response to this, the United States gave Ukraine a game-changing weapon, HIMAR missile system. The map below, the red dots represent heat maps from where the Russians were shooting their guns. The HIMARS are basically satellite-controlled rocket systems that are guided missiles. And if they know how to use them, which the U.S. trained them on, they can be precise in a way that the Russians simply can't match. So the picture on the left there is the Russian artillery shells before the HIMARS, and the picture on the right is after the HIMARS, because the HIMARS are able to target not only the Russian guns, but the ammunition dump and the command centers. This proved to be a very large change in the course of the war. I'll cover that more shortly in part 3 of the war. But as far as the Donbass goes and the agriculture impact, by itself, the Donbass is not a large agricultural player. 8% of the wheat, about 5% of the barley, 10% of the sunflower. So it's not nothing for agriculture. Its bigger issue, though, is its proximity to the regions around the Donbass and to the Black Sea. For the Ukrainians to have any sort of viable export program, they have to, of course, grow the crop and then transport it to the ports of Odessa. Some of the major grain routes from the north and the east of the country, where most of the corn and most of the wheat is grown, was right behind the front lines of a war zone. So logistically, this conflict did have a huge impact on Ukraine's ability to ship agricultural goods, even though if the actual front lines weren't necessarily on the actual ground where the wheat and the corn was grown. Meanwhile, around the world, importing countries took a break from importing wheat. Prices got very, very high after the invasion. There was also very little ability to execute on some contracts. The shipping insurance increased, I think, 500% to insured ships going into the Black Sea. There was some Ukrainian grain that was able to be exported via rail lines into Poland, into Romania, but it was a trickle and not enough to meet the world demand by any means. Around July, the Black Sea Grain Initiative was signed. And initially it was met with quite a bit of fanfare. And we did see a large amount of Ukrainian grain, especially corn, get shipped out. However, it was still relatively, compared to last year, down a third from where they should have been if there was no invasion. We've also seen numerous times where we've seen a major decline in the tonnage shipped out of the Black Sea, both when the Ukrainians attacked the Russian Black Sea fleet at Sevastopol, and also when the Russians have pulled out of the deal to begin with. Where we are now, actually, we've seen a decline and the ability of the grain deal to export tonnage, and the deal is up for renegotiation in mid-March. So there's quite a bit of tension and even controversy on if this deal will continue. So moving on to the present day situation. I mentioned the HIMARS were a game-changing weapon. The Ukrainians were being trained by the Western United States. They were given, the Western powers, including the United States. The amount of military gear they were given was the largest transfer of arms since Lend-Lease in World War II. The Ukrainians launched a very effective counteroffensive in Kharkiv in the north, in Kherson in the south, liberating 2,300 square miles of Ukrainian territory. This represented the worst Russian military defeat since the 1991 Chechen War. In response to this, the Kremlin doubled down. And this is where I think really kind of leads into where we are now, which is politically and militarily, the current state of affairs cannot last. So Ukrainians feel that they have the initiative, they're winning, and Putin responded by announcing the mobilization of 300,000 additional soldiers. You might recall on my initial slide on the invasion, the initial Russian army was 120,000 strong. So Putin nearly tripled that amount by calling up additional reserves. And also, he announced elections for the annexation of the 4 occupied regions of Ukraine. That referendum was passed, and now Russia considers the occupied territory not to be a territory of Ukraine, not to be an independent country, not to be an autonomous region. They consider it to be Russia, along with the Crimea. So in the Russian eyes right now, they're fighting on Russian soil to protect Russian soil. The political stalemate right now is a mixture of 2 things. Number one, as the Ukrainians increasing technology and increasing competency with training from the West, being essentially balanced out by the inflow of Russian conscripts, massed artillery, and then also the utilization of private military companies in Russia. The Battle of Bakhmut is being fought right now. It's the major battle currently ongoing. It is a city in the Donbass that has been compared to the Battle of Verdun, which is one of the bloodiest wars in battles of World War I. It's trench warfare. It is, mass charge against machine guns and barbed wire, and take little ground. But the current state of affairs, the Ukrainians think that they can go for a complete military victory, while the Russians are determined to defend what they consider their hard-won new homeland. So I don't see a military or political situation on the horizon anytime soon. Where the conflict is relative to the Ukrainian agriculture flow, it's a bigger deal for wheat than it is corn. Most of the corn for Ukraine is grown in the north, around Kiev. So stage 1 of the invasion was a very big deal. A good amount of Ukrainian corn capacity was actually knocked out. Ability to store, ability to transport. Wheat was relatively untouched because, again, it was already planted when the invasion started. Now where the conflict is, it is in the heart of the Ukrainian wheat territory. A quick comment on the capacity and the damage done on this war. Before the invasion, about 58 million metric tons of storage existed in Ukraine. They believe anywhere between 8.5 to 10 million metric tons of this capacity has been knocked out. What that means is that relative to both their existing stockpiles, which have never been higher, their wheat harvest and their corn harvest, if Ukraine did not have the ability to export, if the Black Sea Grain Initiative would be shut off, they would not have enough space for all their current tonnage, let alone future tonnage as well, meaning that it doesn't matter how much they could theoretically grow. They wouldn't be able to store it if they couldn't ship it overseas. And again, there's not much of a domestic demand for Ukrainian agricultural goods because 1/5 of the population has unfortunately left. Now, it is encouraging. Most of the capacity for storage in the country is in the heart of the country. It's in the center. However, the front lines, as we saw earlier, they're moving closer to that. So I do anticipate further stress on the Ukrainian ability to store grain, let alone ship. Looking at the damage done for new crop relative to old crop, both for corn and for wheat, the area is down 25%. Production is down quite a bit as well, particularly in corn, falling from a record of 42 million metric tons down to 27. In wheat, falling from 33 million metric tons down to 21. I'd add for corn that nearly 1 million metric tons is still in the field, and it's February. The Ukrainians' harvest is the same harvest as our time frame. They've not been able to complete their harvest due to a mix of weather and the logistics of trying to harvest during a war zone. So 27 million metric tons may be a tad optimistic. So we've seen massive cuts in area and production as well. Where we are now with the export channels, exports peaked in September, both on kind of the goodwill of the grain terminal and the availability of supply after the Ukrainian wheat harvest. The destination for a good chunk of this tonnage happened to be Europe, happened to be developed countries. That was a point that the Kremlin made quite a bit, that the grain corridor deal was actually helping the Europeans more than it was the developing countries. Looking at the tonnage, it does appear that Europe was one of the larger takers of Ukrainian agricultural goods going into the fall here. A rare area of actually increased agricultural activity for Ukraine was the oilseed sector. Most of the oilseeds have value because of the processing, and the Ukrainians are beginning to reward that as well. So on the soybean and rapeseed, we've seen increase, as well as on sunflower oil, and at the expense of corn and wheat. So Ukrainian farmers are like farmers everywhere. They're going to continue to still plant, but it won't be the traditional crops like corn and wheat. They're going to look for where they can find the most margin and where the ground's most conducive. And for now, it looks like soybeans and canola. The destinations as of now for Ukrainian wheat and corn relative to last year, absolutely massive cuts for 2022, down to 4.6 million metric tons of Ukrainian wheat relative to 2018. Turkey and, well, in particular, actually, Egypt had the largest cut. Turkey actually increased because all the Black Sea grain corridor channel has to go through the Straits of Turkey. On the corn side, we did see a reduction compared to years past, not as dramatic as the wheat exports were, however. China still took about 25% of the Ukrainian corn crop, and Turkey, again, actually increased their market share of Ukrainian corn, given their proximity to the inbound vessels from Odessa. Russia, on the other hand, actually had a record wheat harvest. They've been supplying the world with wheats relative to where the Ukrainians were. They picked up market share from the Ukrainians. If you look at where they are now doing business, increase in Saudi Arabia, an increase in Egypt, and an increase in Turkey as well. For next year, they anticipate even a larger crop. So far, Russia has been able to pick up the slack from the global supply chain from Ukraine's absence. But Russia, at any point in time, may decide to turn that off to wrap it up political pressure. I mentioned earlier that Turkey was a very large benefiter of the Ukrainian export program because all the vessels that leave Odessa have to go through Turkey. Turkey saw a large increase after the export deal was signed. Previously, the largest Ukrainian wheat customer was Egypt, and Egypt has not returned. Egypt has given their business to Russia, and Ukraine has been locked out in this market, in a way that never has happened before. One thing that I also want to discuss taking a step back from any particular country. Prices have been rising both in the United States and around the world. Inflation is a worldwide phenomenon. The surge in commodity pricing relative to what happened with the Ukrainian invasion is often underappreciated, but very important. The shock in commodity pricing makes it harder to purchase goods. There's a fiscal response, meaning the government has to either pay more or they have to give out some sort of tax benefits to importers to get the grain. Any good government knows rule number one, feed your people. So they'll find a way to get the money to get the grain. That increases the public debt, okay? Which then in turn weakens the currency, which makes it harder to import the goods the next time around. So on that goes. Pay attention to Turkey and Algeria. These are two countries that have had very large import programs, both in years past and also right now. And the currency has both been devalued and debt has increased, meaning that developing countries are going to have to pay more, relatively speaking, for the same amount of goods. And it's a cycle that won't break until new supply comes online, which does not appear likely anytime soon. To wrap up here, where we are now with the February WASD 2023. Wheat ending stocks lower relative to last year at a 7-year low, just under 270 million metric tons. U.S. stocks lower by 18% year over year. And Ukraine has lost their export program by over a third. But again, the biggest factor is that the world ending stocks are getting tighter, just as the population of the world is increasing every single day. Turning to corn, a little better situation, but still calling for a stock drop. World will go from 306 million metric tons starting the year to 295. The world is banking on a record safrinha crop. Argentina crop's already been cut dramatically. It probably needs to be cut further. Ukraine crop is something that we can't rely on. If the world does not have a record upcoming Brazil safrinha crop, which that harvest will start in the summer, this ending scenario stocks will be dramatically worse. Wrapping up here further, volatility right now has been kind of at a seasonal low. The blue line here was last year. You can probably imagine the spikes came right after the invasion. You have corn on the left and you have wheat on the right. Volatility for wheat reached historic levels. The orange line is where we are now. So at some point, I think we are going to see an increase in volatility. That's just a given historical patterns. But keep in mind what happened last year, right? The black swan occurred. Prices shot up, volatility shot up, and then things kind of simmered down because the world was able to continue to export some production out of Ukraine. The world found other sources of commodities, and we got on with it, so to speak. But in my opinion, that will not be sustainable. So volatility will come back. It's only a question of when. Now, to wrap up here, as I mentioned earlier, black swans create black swans. The Russian invasion was the first black swan. The war lasting a year and counting because of stiff Ukrainian resistance actually is the next black swan. The challenge to feed the world has never been harder. Ending stocks for corn and wheat are tighter. One of the major bread baskets of the world has suffered tremendous damage, not only to their production, but also to their capacity to store, to ship, and to live in their country. 20% of the Ukrainian population has fled. That's a labor force. That's a demand source. This isn't just a drought and you regrow next year. This is one of the major agricultural players in the world that no longer has a place at the table. Geopolitics and domestic politics trump economics, even though you'd think that economics should dictate supply and demand flows. That was not the case. Countries reacted very protectionist once the squeeze of inflation and also the lack of physical supply occurred. Indonesia impacted export bans on palm oil. India dictated bans on wheat exports. And I believe that this kind of thing is going to happen more and more in the future as supplies get tighter and tighter. And the amount of money that into commodities after the invasion was at a record high. That no doubt very much pushed prices higher and volatility. We're beginning to see money come back into commodities ever so slowly. The last thing I guess I would leave with is never think that the market can be range bound forever. Times will come where the market will break out of a range. Relative to last year, the price of a third was probably the fastest I've seen in my tenure. It can happen again. So I would advise everyone to pay attention to Ukraine. The story is not done. It's an ongoing tragedy, of course, and no one knows how it's going to end. But looking back on the previous year, I can say it was certainly the most challenging market that I've encountered, and one that I'm sure I'll remember for years to come. So thank you all. I encourage you all to reach out to myself or anyone in the hedge point if you want to discuss further. And thanks for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. I hope you found this discussion informative and that you have gained valuable insights on the impact of the war on agricultural commodity markets. For those of you who have questions or would like to follow up with Chris, will be available via email. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask him. His contact information is up on the screen. I'd like to extend a big thank you to you, Chris, once again for sharing his expertise and insights with us today. Your contributions have made this webinar truly exceptional. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a great day, and we look forward to see you in our next event. Thank you.